Ideology Chapter 10. The history of all human society, past and present, has been the history of class struggle. Learning objectives. Identify the three broad categories of ideological explicitness, and explain how ideology serves as a disguised language in film. Illustrate how a film's ideology can be differentiated and divided into the left-center-right model traditionally used by journalists and political scientists. Contrast the ideologies found in the bipolar categories listed in the chapter, and position them on the left-center-right model. Explain how a culture, religion, and ethnicity influence the ideology and presentation of values in film. Summarize the achievements of the women's movement within the field of cinema, both on screen and behind the scenes. Evaluate the history of homosexuality in cinema, both on screen and off-screen, and explain why the progress of gay rights has varied from the advancements of other rights groups. Describe the importance of tone on a movie, and describe how elements like genre, narration, and music contribute to the tone. Ideology page 405. Ideology is usually defined as a body of ideas reflecting the social needs and aspirations of an individual, group, class, or culture. The term is generally associated with politics and party platforms, but it can also mean a given set of values that are implicit in any human enterprise, including filmmaking. Virtually every movie presents us with role models, ideal ways of behaving, negative traits, and an implied morality based on the filmmaker's sense of right and wrong. In short, every film has a slant, a given ideological perspective that privileges certain characters, institutions, and behaviors as attractive, and downgrades an opposing set as repellent. Since ancient times, critics have discussed art as having a double function, to teach and to provide pleasure. Some movies emphasize the didactic, the teaching function. How? The most obvious method is simply to preach at the audience. Such movies try to sell us a bill of goods, like TV commercials or propaganda films such as October, 10/6 or Triumph of the Will, 10/12. At the opposite extreme, the abstract wing of the avant-garde cinema, the pictures seem totally devoid of moral values, because in effect they have no subject matter other than pure forms. Their purpose? To provide pleasure. The tradition of classical cinema avoids the extremes of didacticism and pure abstraction, but even light entertainment movies are steeped in value judgments. Classical cinema is the ventriloquist of ideology, states critic Daniel Dayan. Who is ordering these images and to what purpose? Are questions classical filmmakers wish to avoid, for they want the movie to speak for itself. Viewers can absorb the ideological values without being aware of it, as in Talladega Nights, 1018. In actual practice, movies are highly variable in their degree of ideological explicitness. For purposes of convenience, we can classify them under three broad categories: neutral. Escapist films and light entertainment movies often blend out the social environment in favor of a vaguely benevolent setting that allows the story to take place smoothly. The emphasis is on action, pleasure, and entertainment values for their own sake. Issues of right and wrong are treated superficially, with little or no analysis, as in Bringing Up Baby, 10338. The most extreme examples of this category are non-representational avant-garde films like Allures, 1-7, and Fugue, 4-7, which are virtually devoid of ideology. Their values are mainly aesthetic: a color, a shape, a kinetic swirl. Implicit. The protagonists and antagonists represent conflicting value systems, but these are not dwelled on. We must infer what the characters stand for as their tale unfolds. Nobody spells out the moral of the story. The materials are slanted in a particular direction, but transparently, without obvious manipulation, as in Late Autumn, 1016A, and La Ventura, 413. Explicit. Thematically oriented movies aim to teach or persuade as much as to entertain. Patriotic films, many documentaries, political films like Oliver Stone's JFK, 820, and movies with a sociological emphasis, such as John Singleton's Boys and the Hood, 1020E, fall under this category. Usually an admirable character articulates the values that are really important, like Bogart's famous speech at the end of Casablanca, 9-5B. The most extreme examples of this category include propaganda films, which repeatedly advocate a partisan point of view with an overt appeal to our sympathy and support. Serious film critics often zap hard sell movies like these, but a few, like Michael Moore's Fahrenheit 9/11, 10-8, are admired for their wit or their stylistic panache. Perhaps the most famous, or rather infamous, example of explicit movie-making was the school of socialist realism that prevailed in the former Soviet Union, especially during the brutal totalitarian regime of Joseph Stalin. Socialist realism was strongly propagandistic. Movies, books, and other media were required by law to educate the masses. Creative artists were severely restricted in what they could and could not include in their works. Art had to be optimistic and hopeful. Negative traits, especially individualism, had to be confined to villains. Protagonists had to be heroic, with no serious moral failings. Artists were mandated to keep their style simple and unadorned. No decadent experimentation was tolerated. Narratives had to center on communal enterprises, not individual goals. The wider social good had to be emphasized above solitary striving. Romance and private feelings, if present at all, always had to yield to the public good. In short, the individual was de-emphasized, and the communal was privileged. Happily, all these draconian requirements were scrapped with the collapse of communism in 1989, through in present-day Russia and some of its former satellites. Artists are still not totally free to pursue whatever subjects they wish, and it's very dangerous to criticize the politicians who run the country. The overwhelming majority of fiction films fall into the implicit category. In other words, because the characters don't talk at length about what they believe in, we've got to dig beneath the surface and construct their value systems on the basis of what their goals are, what they take for granted, how they behave with others, how they react to a crisis, and so on. Filmmakers create sympathetic characters by dramatizing such traits as idealism, courage, generosity, fair play, kindness, and loyalty. In the American cinema especially, the star system is often a clue to values, especially when the protagonist is played by a personality star like John Wayne, 10-3A. Actor stars are less likely to be ideologically weighted. For example, Daniel Day-Lewis has played villainous characters as well as admirable men. Good looks and sex appeal are compelling traits, predisposing us in favor of a given character. Sometimes an actor's appeal is so strong that he or she can win over an audience even in ideologically opposite roles, like Tom Cruise in the right-leaning Top Gun or the left-wing Born on the 4th of July. Similarly, Julia Roberts' performance in Pretty Woman is so spontaneous and charismatic that she can almost make us forget that her character as written is little more than a compendium of sexist cliches, a distressed Cinderella in need of being rescued by a man. There are a variety of other methods to enlist our sympathies. Underdog almost automatically win us over to their side. Emotionally vulnerable characters appeal to our protective instincts. People who are funny, charming, and/or intelligent are similarly winning. In fact, these traits can do much to soften our dislike of an otherwise negative character. In The Silence of the Lambs, the character of Hannibal the Cannibal, Anthony Hopkins, is a psychotic killer, but because he's also witty and imaginative, we are oddly attracted to him, at least from a distance. Negatively drawn characters incorporate such traits as selfishness, mean-spiritedness, greed, cruelty, tyrannical behavior, disloyalty, and so on. Villains and other repellent characters are often played by actors who are made to look unattractive. The more explicit the ideology, the more such traits are portrayed without mitigation. However, except for melodramas, in which good and evil are usually treated in black and white terms, Most film characters combine positive and negative traits. This is especially so in movies that aspire to be lifelike and realistic, like Story of Women, 10:4. Analyzing a character's ideological values is often a difficult task precisely because many characters are a fusion of contradictory sentiments. To further complicate the issue, a character's ideological values are not necessarily those of the filmmaker. For example, the movies of the French director Jean-Luc Godard often feature characters of various ideologies, and we can never be entirely certain whether Godard agrees with them or to what extent. Some filmmakers are so technically skillful that we can be swept up by a character's values even when we don't hold them in actuality. For example, many of the positive values of D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Racist are embodied in the character of the Little Colonel, one of the founders of the Ku Klux Klan. Few of us would applaud the racist values of the Klan in real life, but while watching the movie, it's necessary to suspend our personal beliefs in order to enter the worldview of the protagonist and the filmmaker. For those who cannot, the film must remain a moral failure, notwithstanding its stylistic brilliance. In short, ideology is another language system in film, but it's an often disguised language that usually speaks in codes. We have seen how dialects can be ideological, as in All Screwed Up, 528, and Trainspotting, 5298. Editing styles, especially a manipulative style like Soviet montage, can be profoundly ideological, like the Odessa Steps sequence from Potemkin, 423. Costumes and decor can suggest ideological ideas, as can be seen in movies like The Leopard, 7258. Even space is ideologically charged in such films as The Grifters, 219B, Henry V, and Dances with Wolves, 1013A and 1013B. In other words, political ideas can be found in form as well as content. A lot of people claim that they're not interested in politics, but virtually everything is ultimately ideological. Our attitudes toward sex, work, power sharing, authority, the family, religion, all of these involve ideological assumptions, whether we're conscious of the fact or not. In movies, too, characters rarely articulate their political credos, but in most cases, we can piece together their ideological values and assumptions on the basis of their casual remarks about these topics. A word of caution: ideological labels are just that, labels. Seldom do they approach the complexity of human beliefs. After all, most of us are liberal about some matters and conservative about others. The same can be said about movies and the characters in them. The following value systems are merely roadmaps that can be helpful in determining a movie's ideology, but unless they're applied with sensitivity and common sense, these labels can be crudely simplistic. The left-center-right model traditionally, journalists and political scientists have used a tripartite left-center-right model in differentiating political ideologies. In actual practice, these orientations can be broken down even further, as in Figure 10.5. An example of the extreme leftist position would be communism under Stalin, 10.6. At the extreme right, the Nazi Empire under Hitler, 10.12. Both extremes are totalitarian systems, of course. We can differentiate a film's ideology by focusing on some key institutions and values and analyzing how the characters relate to them. Some of these key elements are presented next in bipolar categories. Neither the left nor the right is necessarily better or worse than the other. There have been eloquent proponents for each side. However, the totalitarian extremes have produced few rational enthusiasts. Democratic versus hierarchical leftists tend to emphasize the similarities among people. We all eat about the same amount of food, breathe the same amount of air. Likewise, leftists believe that a society's resources should be distributed in roughly equal portions, as is implied in the Human Condition, 10.7, and Pishadi, 10.14. Authority figures are merely skilled managers and not intrinsically superior to the people they are responsible to. Important institutions should be publicly owned. In some societies, all basic industries such as banking, utilities, health, and education are operated for the equal benefit of all citizens. The emphasis is on the collective, the communal. Rightists emphasize the differences between people, insisting that the best and the brightest are entitled to a larger share of power and the economic pie than less productive workers, as is implied in Henry V, 10138. Authority should be respected. Social institutions are guided by strong leaders, not the rank and file or even average citizens. Most institutions should be privately owned, with profit as the main incentive to productivity. The emphasis is on the individual and an elite managerial class. Environment versus heredity. Leftists believe that human behavior is learned and can be changed by proper environmental incentives. Antisocial behavior is largely the result of poverty, prejudice, lack of education, and low social status rather than human nature or lack of character, as in the chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, 1019. Rightists believe that character is largely inborn and genetically inherited. Hence the emphasis of many right-wingers on lineage and the advantage of coming from a good family, as in Late Spring, 815, and Late Autumn, 10168. In some Asian societies especially, ancestor worship is common. Relative versus absolute. People on the left believe that we ought to be flexible in our judgments, capable of adjusting to the specifics of each case. Children are characteristically raised in a permissive environment and encouraged in self-expression, as in My Life as a Dog, 898. Moral values are merely social conventions, not eternal verities. Issues of right and wrong must be placed in a social context, including any mitigating circumstances, before we can judge them fairly. Rightists are more absolute in judging human behavior. Children are expected to be disciplined, respectful, and obedient to their elders. Right and wrong are fairly clear-cut and ought to be evaluated according to a strict code of conduct, as in Pinocchio. Violations of moral principles ought to be punished to maintain law and order and to set an example for others. Secular versus religious. Leftists believe that religion, like sex, is a private matter and should not be the concern of governments. Some left-wingers are atheists or agnostics, although some of the most famous have been members of the clergy, like the leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Most leftists are humanists. Religious skeptics frequently invoke the authority of science to refute traditional religious beliefs. Others are openly critical of organized religion, which they view as simply another social institution with a set of economic interests to protect, as in Aguirre, The Wrath of God, 623. Leftists who are religious tend to be attracted to progressive denominations, which are more democratically organized than authoritarian or hierarchical religions. Rightists accord religion a privileged status, as in the Virgin Spring, 1011. Some authoritarian societies decree an official faith for all their citizens, and non-believers are sometimes treated as second-class citizens, if they are tolerated at all. The clergy enjoy a prestigious status and are respected as moral arbiters. Piety is regarded as a sign of superior virtue and spirituality. Future versus past. In general, leftists view the past with disdain because it was dominated by ignorance, class conflict, and exploitation of the weak. The future, on the other hand, is filled with hope, with infinite promise of improvement, as can be seen in High Hopes, 10:8. The optimism that typifies many left-wingers is based on the idea of progress and evolution toward a more just and equitable society. People on the right have a deep veneration for the past, for ancient rituals, and especially for tradition. Virtually all of the films of Yasujiro Ozu typify these traits. Rightists tend to disdain the present as a corruption of a lost golden age, like John Ford's The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. They view the future with skepticism, for it holds only more change, and change is what trashed the glories of the past. Consequently, rightists tend to be pessimistic about the human condition, citing the laxness of standards and crumbling morality of modern life. Many of the films of Ingmar Bergman reflect this pessimistic view. cooperation versus competition. People on the left believe that social progress is best achieved by a cooperative effort on the part of all citizens toward a common goal, as in October 10-6. The role of government is to guarantee the basic needs of life, work, health, education, and so forth, and this can be most efficiently accomplished if everyone feels he or she is contributing to the common good. Rightists emphasize open market principles and the need for competition to bring out the best in everyone, as in Safety Last, 428, a classic film text of the American go-getter philosophy of the 1920s. Social progress is fueled by ambition and a strong desire to win, to dominate, as in Mildred Pierce, 11138, and Without Limits, 331a. The role of government is to protect private property, provide security through a strong military, and guarantee maximum freedom in the economic realm. Outsiders versus insiders. Leftists identify with the poor, the disenfranchised. They often romanticize rebels and outsiders, like Bonnie and Clyde, 112a, and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. Leftists are pluralistic in the sense that they respect and value ethnic diversity and are sensitive to the needs of women and minorities. Left-leaning movies often feature protagonists who are ordinary people, especially working-class characters, peasants, and laborers, such as those in Bicycle Thieves, 6338, and Open City, 112b. Rightists tend to identify with the establishment, the people in power, the people who run things. They emphasize the importance of leadership in determining the main course of history, as in the Rambo films and Henry V, 10138. Right-leaning movies tend to feature protagonists who are authority figures, patriarchs, military commanders, and entrepreneurs, as in The Searchers, 1038. International versus nationalistic. Leftists are global in their perspective, emphasizing the universality of human needs irrespective of country, race, or culture, as in Hearts and Minds, 1-3. They often refer to the family of man as a more appropriate perspective than the narrow limits of the nuclear family. Right-wingers tend to be strongly patriotic, often regarding people from other countries as vaguely inferior. Family, country, and God is a popular slogan in many right-wing societies. It might well represent the credo of the great American director John Ford, whose epic westerns are fervently nationalistic, Wagon Master, My Darling Clementine, and Fort Apache, to name just three. Unlike leftists, who believe that criticism makes a country stronger and more flexible, right-wingers believe that criticism weakens a nation, making it more vulnerable to outside attack. Sexual freedom versus marital monogamy. Leftists believe that who you have sex with is nobody else's business. They often accept homosexuality as a valid lifestyle, and they reject attempts to regulate sexual behavior among consenting adults, as in Seven Beauties, 10228. In the area of reproduction, too, leftists emphasize privacy, personal choice, and non-interference. Birth control, including abortion as well as contraception, is regarded as a basic right. Rightists regard the family as a sanctified institution, and anything that threatens the family is viewed with hostility, as in Ford's The Grapes of Wrath, 1015. Premarital sex, homosexuality, and extramarital sex are condemned. Similarly, right-wingers tend to oppose abortion, which they consider a form of infanticide. In some societies, sex is justified only as a means of procreation, and contraception is forbidden. Heterosexual monogamy within the institution of marriage is the only acceptable expression of sexuality, as can be illustrated by most American mainstream movies before the 1960s. Even ideologically explicit movies don't hit on all of these value structures, but virtually every fiction film deals with some of them. Culture, religion, and ethnicity. Social culture encompasses the traditions, institutions, arts, myths, and beliefs that are characteristic of a given community or population. In heterogeneous societies such as Israel and the United States, many cultural groups coexist within one national boundary. In homogeneous nations such as Japan or Saudi Arabia, which are ethnically uniform. A single cultural hegemony tends to be the rule. Cultural generalizations, like most generalizations, are true most of the time. But there are many exceptions, especially in the arts, which often go against the grain in terms of generally accepted cultural norms. Without a knowledge of these norms, however, it's hard to relate to some movies, especially foreign films, because their cultures are radically different from our own. Cultural generalizations can easily degenerate into stereotypes unless they're applied judiciously, with respect for nuances. For example, Japanese movies, like Japanese society in general, tend to be ideologically conservative, stressing such values as social conformity, the supremacy of the family system, patriarchy, and the wisdom of consensus. The movies of the Japanese master Ozu typify these values best, most notably Late Spring, 8:15, and An Autumn Afternoon, 11:21. Most Japanese people view nonconformity and individualism with abhorrence, a ridiculous form of egotism and arrogance. Yet the works of Kobayashi, 10-7, and Naru's 1024A side with protagonists who are oppressed by their cultures. For people who haven't been exposed to alternative cultures, their own norms might seem universal. Their knowledge of other cultures is often derived from movies. For example, American films typically sympathize with the individual versus society. Most movies romanticize underdog, rebels, outlaws, and mavericks, especially in such genres as gangster films, westerns, and action movies, which stress violence and extremes of individuality. American films are also strongly sexual and fast-paced compared with most foreign movies. Typically, many people stereotype Americans as lawless, sex-obsessed, and fast. Likewise, American audiences are often puzzled by foreign movies because they're looking for familiar, that is, American, cultural signposts. Failing to find them, they dismiss the movie rather than their irrelevant cultural assumptions. For example, characters in Japanese movies seldom disagree publicly. This would be considered rude. Consequently, we must read between the lines to discover what they're really thinking, see 9-8b. Similarly, Japanese characters rarely look each other steadily in the eyes when conversing, unless they are interacting with intimates or social equals. In America, maintaining eye contact is considered sincere, forthright, and honest. In Japan, it's considered impertinent and disrespectful. Every nation has a characteristic way of looking at life, a set of values that is typical of a given culture. The same can be said of their movies. For example, because of England's glorious literary heritage and international preeminence in the live theatre, British movies tend to be strongly literary, with an emphasis on polished scripts, literate dialogue, urbane acting, and lavish costumes and decor. Many of the best English movies are literary and theatrical adaptations. Most notably, the works of Shakespeare, 1013a. But there is always the other, a counter-tradition that's dialectically opposed to what might be considered the dominant strain in a culture. In the British cinema, this counterculture is represented by a left-wing school of filmmaking that emphasizes working-class life, contemporary settings, regional dialects, loose scripting, a more emotional method-oriented style of acting, and a strong anti-establishment ideology. Movies like High Hopes, 10-8 are typical of this counter-tradition. Similarly, the cinema of Sweden is dominated by the austere Lutheranism that underlies the psychology of many Swedish movies, especially those of their greatest filmmaker, Ingmar Bergman, 1011. Films from developing countries tend to be preoccupied with issues such as neocolonialism, underdevelopment, the oppression of women, and especially poverty, 1014, 1025b. In culturally diverse countries like the United States, there are many subcultures, pockets of cultural values that coexist within the dominant ideology. Movies that explore subcultures generally emphasize the fragile balance between conflicting cultural values, like Yoki's of the Grapes of Wrath, 1015, and the hostility they encounter when they try to integrate with established communities in California. Other American movies emphasize lifestyle subcultures, like the military personnel of Three Kings, the hippies of Easy Rider, the junkies of Drugstore Cowboy, and the gay friends of Longtime Companion. An added complication of any ideological analysis involves period and historical context. For example, American films made during the Depression in the 1930s reflect many of the left-wing values of Roosevelt's New Deal. During the turbulent Vietnam Watergate era, roughly from 1965 to 1975, the American cinema became increasingly violent, confrontational, and anti-authoritarian. During the Reagan era of the 1980s, American movies turned to the right, like American society in general. Many movies made during that period emphasize military supremacy, competition, power, and wealth. Religious values involve many of the same complexities. Even religions that purport to be universal, like Roman Catholicism, are radically different from country to country. These differences are reflected in their movies. For example, in Europe the Church is regarded as a pillar of conservatism. French Catholicism is strongly influenced by Jansenism, an austere, quasi-deterministic sect that somewhat resembles Calvinism or Scandinavian Lutheranism. Many of the films of Robert Bresson reflect these Jansenist values. In Italy, on the other hand, Catholicism takes on a more theatrical, aesthetic flavor, as in the movies of Federico Fellini. Italy's rich heritage in the decorative and fine arts was largely church-sponsored during the medieval period and the Renaissance. In much of Catholic Latin America, the liberation theology movement is strongly left-wing and even revolutionary in its orientation. Protestantism too is a virtual smorgasbord of religious diversity. There are vast differences between the joyous black fundamentalism of the preacher's wife and the stern, born-again faith of the protagonist of Tender Mercies, 1120, who is white, southern, working class, and country. Most religions can be divided into liberal and conservative wings, each with its own agenda of priorities. Fundamentalist sects are right-wing in their values, emphasizing strict conformity to a body of religious and moral beliefs, usually based on a traditional holy book. Protestant fundamentalists can further be differentiated by race. White fundamentalists are deeply conservative on virtually all matters, but African American religious groups tend to be liberal politically. They were in the forefront of the civil rights movement of the 1960s, and its leader, of course, was a clergyman, the Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr. However, black fundamentalists tend to be staunchly conservative in matters of faith and morals. Sometimes one religious sect strongly objects to the portrayal of a revered figure in the arts. For example, Martin Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ, based on the Greek novel by Nikos Kazantzakis, portrays Jesus from a humanist perspective. All Christians believe in the divinity of Jesus, but most denominations emphasize the God rather than the man. Hence the fierce outcry from Christian fundamentalists about Scorsese's movie, which portrays Jesus as flawed, tormented with doubt. Critic Scott Amon responded to these attacks. In daring to give us a Christ of flesh and blood, Scorsese has violated what protesters, in their mad, delusive certainty, believe to be their copyright on Jesus, but simply because their minds are most comfortable with, and are probably only capable of encompassing a dashboard Jesus, is no reason for those terms to define the limits of public discussion. Ethnic groups are distinct social communities within a larger cultural system that claim or are accorded special status, usually inferior, on the basis of such considerations as religion, language, ancestry, and race. In short, what we call minority groups. In the United States, such groups include African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and of course the many waves of immigration from abroad, especially those who have not been fully integrated into the American mainstream, like the Chinese Americans of the Joy Luck Club. Movies with an ethnic slant usually dramatize the tensions between the dominant culture and the beleaguered values of a minority community. For example, In the Australian cinema, a number of movies have dealt with the clash between the predominantly white, Anglo-Saxon power structure and the dark-skinned Aboriginal peoples, who have a long heritage of oppression and exploitation, as in The Chant of Jimmy Blacksmith, 1019. Similarly, Come See the Paradise deals with the forced evacuation of Japanese Americans into relocation camps during World War II. America was also at war with Germany and Italy during this era, but no one suggested that people of German and Italian descent might constitute a security risk. Germans and Italians are Caucasians. African American film historians have chronicled the sad, shameful treatment of blacks in American movies, a mean-spirited reflection of their treatment in American society as a whole. For the first 50 years of the American cinema, black characters were usually relegated to demeaning stereotypes, 1021. In the 1950s, actor Sidney Poitier rose to the top 10 not as a singer, dancer, or comedian, but as a straight leading man. Poitier's wholesome good looks and all-American sense of decency were admired by white and black audiences alike. Poitier's enormous popularity was an opening wedge in the treatment of African American characters in movies. Images of blacks improved steadily, but slowly, after the 1950s. However, even today racist stereotypes are hardly unusual in American films and television. In the contemporary cinema, no African American filmmaker has provoked more controversy than Spike Lee, 10188. Much of Lee's criticism has been directed at people of his own race. In Do the Right Thing, he explores the smoldering tensions between black ghetto dwellers and an Italian-American family that owns a pizzeria in an inner-city neighborhood, 514A. In Jungle Fever, it's defeated by the prejudices of their own communities as well as their personal failings. Ethnic filmmakers tend to favor realism as a style, 10208. In the first place, realism is cheaper. Scenes can be shot in the streets, without the need for expensive studio sets. Such filmmakers often must work with small budgets, and consequently they rarely include costly special effects or elaborate equipment. Realism also excels in portraying the actual textures and sociological details of authentic locations. Feminism in the late 1960s was an era of intense political turmoil, not only in America but also in much of Western Europe. Feminism, also known as the Women's Liberation Movement, or simply the Women's Movement, was one of several militant ideologies that emerged during this period. In the field of cinema, the achievement of the women's movement has been considerable, though most present-day feminists would insist that there is still much to be accomplished in the battle against patriarchal values. 1022A. The Hollywood Reporter recently pointed out that only 7% of Hollywood film directors are women. During the heyday of the big Hollywood studios, and especially the 1930s through the 1950s, the status of women within the industry was dismal. There were no women in the upper echelons of management. Out of the thousands of movies produced by the studios, only a handful were directed by women, and virtually none were produced by them. The unions also discriminated against females, allowing very few to enter their ranks. True, there were some women in the areas of screenwriting, editing, and costuming, but only in the field of acting did women enjoy a degree of prominence. After all, it was simply not economically feasible to exclude women from in front of the camera. To this day, most of the powerful women in Hollywood have come from the acting ranks. Even female stars were treated like second-class citizens during the big studio era. Rarely did the leading lady get top billing over the male lead. Females usually receive smaller salaries than males, a pattern that still persists. Females usually had shorter careers because they were thought to be too old for leading roles once they were past 40. Male stars like Cary Grant, Gary Cooper, and John Wayne were still playing leads in their 60s. They were often paired with women 20 or 30 years younger than themselves, a pattern rarely permitted for those few female stars who somehow managed to hold on past 40. For example, Actresses like Joan Crawford and Bette Davis spent the final 20 years of their long careers playing mostly grotesque caricatures. It was the only work they could get. Within the movies themselves, women were usually socially constructed as the other or the outsider in a male-dominated world, as feminist critic Annette Kuhn has pointed out. Women didn't get to tell their own stories because the images were controlled by men. Generally, women were treated as sex objects, valued primarily for their good looks and sex appeal. Their main function was to support their men, seldom to lead a fulfilling life of their own. Marriage and a family were their most frequent goals, rarely a meaningful career. In the majority of studio-produced films, female characters were marginalized, seldom at the center of the action. The heroine's function was to cheer from the sidelines, to wait passively until the hero claimed her for his reward. Certain characteristics were regarded as intrinsically masculine: intellect, ambition, sexual confidence, independence, professionalism. All of these traits were generally presented as inappropriate and unseemly in women. Certain Hollywood genres were more hospitable to women: love stories, domestic family dramas, screwball comedies, romantic comedies, and musicals. The most important genre was the women's picture, usually domestic melodramas emphasizing a female star and focusing on typical female concerns such as getting or holding onto a man, raising children, or balancing a career with marriage. Marriage was almost invariably presented as the wiser choice when a woman was confronted with a conflict between her career and her man. Women who chose otherwise usually suffered for their folly, like the heroine of Mildred Pierce, 11138. It was in such genres as these that some of the studio era's greatest actresses flourished: Bette Davis, Katharine Hepburn, Claudette Colbert, Barbara Stanwyck, Carole Lombard, Marlene Dietrich, and Greta Garbo, to name a few. Today there are about 24 women directors working in the mainstream Hollywood film industry, and their presence has made a difference. The range of female roles has broadened considerably since the 1960s. Outside of North America and Europe, however, sexism is as dominant as ever, especially in developing countries where the oppression of women is harshest, both in films and in the larger society. Women in poorer countries are often denied equal nutrition and healthcare because they are valued less than men. In Southern Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, females lag behind males at all levels of achievement, power, and status. Female infanticide is common in many parts of China and India, especially in rural areas. Traditional rituals, including female circumcision, are practiced throughout much of Africa and parts of the Middle East, contributing to poor reproductive health. In Africa alone, 80 million women undergo circumcision, which involves removing a female's clitoris, thus depriving her of one of the main sources of sexual pleasure. Many African cultures regard this as a purifying practice, deadening a woman's interest in sex. Sexual pleasure is regarded as appropriate only in males. Women are their sexual objects, a view not entirely foreign in the West. 1022b. According to the World Watch Institute, reproductive problems are the leading killer of women of childbearing age throughout the developing world. At least 1 million females die each year, and more than 100 million suffer disabling illnesses from circumcision, unsafe abortions, pregnancy complications, and childbirth. AIDS claims 100,000 women's lives annually, mostly in Africa. Out of 854 million illiterate adults in the world, 543 million are women. The status of women in most, not all, Islamic societies is deplorable. True, 2 women have even risen to the rank of prime minister in predominantly Islamic countries, but such examples are freak occurrences. Islamic religious codes allow a man to have up to 4 wives, which is not allowed for females. In effect, the law says that it takes 4 women to equal 1 man. The right to vote, drive, work, walk in public without a male family member, or even to receive a meaningful education are denied or curtailed in most Muslim societies. According to author Frida Fisches, where there is more education, women tend to have more rights, as in Jordan, Iran, Morocco, and Turkey. The most extreme form of female oppression was in Afghanistan under the rule of the notorious fundamentalists, the Taliban. Prior to their takeover, 40% of the workforce was female, including over 50% of the teachers and physicians. The Taliban prevented women from working anywhere but in the home. Girls did not attend school. In Pakistan, the situation for women is often barbaric. A woman who reports that she has been raped is liable to be arrested for adultery or fornication, since she admits to sex outside of marriage, unless she can provide 4 male eyewitnesses to the rape. Dr. Shersha Syed, a prominent gynecologist in Karachi, told the New York Times, "When I treat rape victims, I tell the girls not to go to the police, because if she goes to the police will rape her." The Pakistani Human Rights Commission estimated that 70 to 90% of women in this country of 145 million suffer some kind of domestic violence at the hands of their husbands, fathers, and brothers. If these women dare to complain to the authorities, few of them do, they're often told to go home and keep quiet. The situation is even worse in Afghanistan. According to Medica Mondiale, a non-profit women's organization, an estimated 60 to 80% of Afghan marriages are forced. More than half of Afghan girls are married before they turn 16, and many of them are married to men several decades older. The exchange of girls to resolve a crime, debt, or household dispute is also common. These practices are the ultimate in women as property. In Japan, there has been a long tradition of women's pictures that characteristically center on the injustices of the ubiquitous family system. Filmmakers such as Kenji Mizoguchi and Mikio Naru's 10248, both men, specialized in women's genres. There is an old Confucian adage that a female should obey her father when she is a girl, her husband when she is mature, and her son when she is old. This has been the prevailing view in Japan throughout most of its history. Japanese girls are brought up to believe that marriage and motherhood are the most rewarding achievements in life. A career and economic independence are poor substitutes. Women constitute only about 20% of the university population, and they are still discriminated against in the job market, where they aren't taken seriously. Women almost never hold upper management positions. The divorce rate in Japan is still only about 1/18 of that in America, in part because older women find it virtually impossible to make a decent living wage. In present-day Japan, the lot of women is improving, but they are still an oppressed group compared with their Western counterparts. The sympathy of filmmakers like Mizoguchi and Naru's was based not on sentimentality, but on hard social realities. Despite attempts by the unsympathetic to reduce the women's movement to trivialities like bra burning, contemporary feminists have concentrated on such fundamentals as equal pay for equal work, adequate prenatal care for pregnant women, domestic violence, abortion rights, childcare, sexual harassment on the job, date rape, and female solidarity. 10258. Not all women filmmakers are feminists, and not all feminists are women. Lana Wertmüller's movies usually feature male protagonists. 10228. The films of Kathryn Bigelow and many of those of Penny Marshall, like Big and Awakenings, are gender neutral. However, most women directors tend to favor female protagonists. Feminist filmmakers, both male and female, are attempting to overcome prejudice through their movies by providing fresh perspectives. 1026. What do women want? Freud once asked in exasperation. Film critic Molly Haskell has answered succinctly, "We want nothing less, on or off the screen, than the wide variety and dazzling diversity of male options." 1024b. Maria Full of Grace, Colombia, 2004, with Catalina Sandino Moreno, written and directed by Joshua Marston. Economic desperation is the fate of many women in much of Latin America. In this film, the protagonist, A pregnant 17-year-old girl who has been deserted by her loutish boyfriend is anxious to help her impoverished family. She decides to become a mule, a drug smuggler who must ingest 62 latex-wrapped pellets of heroin, destined for the United States. If one of the pellets should burst, she would die an agonizing death. The movie is as taut as a thriller, but photographed and edited as though it were a documentary. Fine Line features queer cinema. The gay liberation movement drew much of its inspiration from other revolutionary groups of the 1960s, especially feminism and the Black liberation movement. There was a difference, however. Whereas women and people of color could not pretend to be the other, most homosexuals could pass for straight. They often did, and still do, because of the social prejudice against them. Hence the phrase, in the closet, when a gay person conceals his or her sexual identity from the outside world and passes for straight. Sexual researchers are by no means in agreement on what causes homosexuality. Following the lead of Freud, such researchers as Kinsey and Masters and Johnson regard all sexual behavior as learned, not innate. Freud believed that the libido, sexual energy, is non-discriminatory, amoral, and channeled by social conventions. In short, we have to learn what's normal sexually. Other researchers believe that homosexuality is inborn, like other genetic characteristics. Recent medical findings on the structure of the brain tend to support the physiological basis for homosexuality. Both groups agree that gender identity is formed before puberty, before a person has any conscious sense of his or her sexuality. Hardcore heterosexuals who view lesbians and gays as not natural are missing the point. These researchers insist a person's same-gender orientation is not something he or she chooses. Rather, it chooses them. Their sexuality is as natural to them as that of heterosexuals. The Kinsey Institute has found that homosexuality is more widespread than is generally believed. In a variety of scientific surveys, researchers have estimated that roughly 10% of the American population is homosexual. A much larger percentage, as high as 33%, have had at least one homosexual experience. Many commentators believe that sexual labels are convenient fictions, that all of us have our masculine and feminine sides. The big lie about lesbians and gay men is that we do not exist, noted film historian Vito Russo. Because of their long history of persecution, homosexuals until the 1960s kept a low profile. 100 years ago, homosexuality was punishable by death in Britain. In many societies, it is still a prisonable offense, even between consenting adults. The Nazis incarcerated in concentration camps hundreds of thousands of homosexuals along with Jews, Gypsies, Slavs, and other undesirables. Homosexuality is commonplace in the arts and entertainment fields, where it's not regarded as relevant to talent. Bisexuality is even more common. In the larger society, however, the hostility toward gays has been so strong that most artists, especially actors, have gone to considerable lengths to conceal their sexual identity. Bisexual film stars like Marlene Dietrich, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, and James Dean were regarded as straight in their own day. Very few people outside of show business knew that Montgomery Clift and Rock Hudson, 1027B, were gay. Such public knowledge would undermine their credibility as romantic leading men, they believed. Of course, this secrecy also made them easy prey to blackmail, one of the main reasons militant gays insist on the need to acknowledge their sexuality publicly. Interestingly, androgynous traits in such female stars as Dietrich, Garbo, and Mae West seemed to make them popular, but seldom were male stars allowed any sexual ambiguity on the screen. Homophobia, like racism and sexism, was widespread in the cinema until recently. Gay men were characteristically stereotyped as sissies and pansies. Lesbians were portrayed as mannish, bold dykes. There were some exceptions, however, most notably in the avant-garde cinema and the pre-Nazi German cinema of the 1920s. In the 1970s and after, The films of Francois Truffaut out-featured characters who happen to be gay but don't make a big deal out of it. The bisexual writer Gore Vidal, who wrote several Hollywood screenplays, stated, "As for overt homosexuality in pre-1960 films, it was not attempted and not possible, but subtexts did occasionally insert themselves." Vidal was referring to movies that seem heterosexual on the surface, but homosexual undertones are implied. No one says outright that the characters played by Elisha Cook, Jr., and Peter Lorre in The Maltese Falcon are gay, but the film is strewn with hints to that effect. Other movies with gay subtexts include Queen Christina, Ben-Hur, both versions, Gilda, The Outlaw, Rope, Rebel Without a Cause, Strangers on a Train, Spartacus, Mean Streets, Midnight Cowboy, 1030E, and most buddy films. After the 1960s, movies dealing overtly with gay themes became more common, especially in America and Europe. In part, this was because the old production code, the Hollywood film industry's censorship arm, was scrapped in favor of the present-day rating system. Many of these movies portrayed gays as deeply neurotic, sex-obsessed, and self-loathing. Often they ended with the gay character committing suicide. Nonetheless, such important movies as Dog Day Afternoon, Cabaret, Another Country, Sunday Bloody Sunday, My Beautiful Laundrette, Working Girls, Performance, La Cage aux Folles, Mona Lisa, Longtime Companion, Philadelphia, and many of the works of Germany's Rainer Werner Fassbinder and Spain's Pedro Almodovar are multidimensional in their treatment of gay characters. The camp sensibility is especially associated with the culture of male homosexuals, though it's not their exclusive province. Heterosexual Johnny Depp enjoys inserting campy touches in his performances, especially in the Pirates of the Caribbean series. Female heterosexuals like Mae West, Carol Burnett, and Bette Midler are strongly campy in their work. Nor is it necessarily typical of all male gays. For example, Eisenstein, Murnau, Jean Vigo, and George Cukor were all homosexuals, but there's nothing campy about their movies. Well, perhaps Cukor's the women. Pedro Almodovar is the supreme master of the camp sensibility in such contemporary social comedies as Matador, Women on the Verge of a Nervous Breakdown, and All About My Mother, 1029B. Comic mockery is a pervasive trait in camp movies, especially when it involves anything bizarre and outrageous, like the characters in the cult classic The Rocky Horror Picture Show, 625. Camp delights in artistic excess, anything artificial, kitschy, and florid, like Carmen Miranda's garish banana dance in The Gang's All Here, choreographed by a grandmaster of camp, Busby Berkeley. Camp frequently uses theatrical metaphors, role-playing, hammy performances, and life as theater comparisons, like Sonya Braga's tormented heroine in Kiss of the Spider-Woman. Lavishly gaudy costumes and sets, anything in really bad taste, are also campy, 1030B. Camp favors certain female stars as cult idols, especially plastic performers like Joan Crawford and Lana Turner, whose glossy women's pictures were originally intended to be taken seriously. These martyrs love not wisely but too well. They suffer. They survive. But mostly they suffer. And they do it all in glitzy designer clothes and sumptuously appointed dwellings. Tone. A movie's tone refers to its manner of presentation, the general atmosphere that a filmmaker creates through his or her attitude toward the dramatic materials. Tone can strongly affect our responses to a given set of values. Tone can also be elusive in movies, especially in those works in which it deliberately shifts from scene to scene. In movies like David Lynch's Blue Velvet, for example, we can never be sure of what to make of the events, because Lynch's tone is sometimes mocking, other times bizarre, and occasionally terrifying. In one scene, an innocent high school girl, Laura Dern, recounts to her boyfriend, Kyle MacLachlan, a dream she had about a perfect world. With her blonde hair radiating with halo lighting, she seems almost angelic. In the background, We hear organ music emanating from a church. The music and lighting subtly mock her naivete as a form of stupidity. A film's tone can be orchestrated in a number of ways. Acting styles strongly affect our response to a given scene. In the Orion 10328, for example, the tone is objective, matter-of-fact. The acting style by the largely non-professional cast is scrupulously realistic. They don't exaggerate the desperation of their situation with heightened emotional fervor. Genre also helps determine a film's tone. Epic films are generally presented with a dignified, larger-than-life importance, as in The Searchers, 1038 or October, 106. The best thrillers are usually tough, mean, and hard-boiled, like Double Indemnity, 117A, and The Grifters, 219B. In comedies, the tone is generally flip, playful, and even silly. A voiceover narrator can be useful for setting a tone that's different from an objective presentation of a scene, creating a double perspective on the events. Voiceovers can be ironic, as in Sunset Boulevard, 5308, sympathetic, as in Dances with Wolves, 1013B, paranoid, as in Taxi Driver, 612, or cynical as in A Clockwork Orange, 58A, which is narrated by a thug. Music is a common way to establish a movie's tone. A music track consisting primarily of rock and roll will be very different in tone from a picture that's accompanied by Mozart or Ray Charles. In Spike Lee's Jungle Fever, Italian-American scenes are accompanied by the ballads of Frank Sinatra. The African-American scenes are underscored by gospel and soul music. Without taking a film's tone into account, a mechanistic analysis of its ideological values can be misleading. For example, Howard Hawks' Bringing Up Baby, 10338 might be interpreted as a leftist critique of a decadent society. Set in the final years of the Great Depression, the movie deals with the desperate schemes of an idle society woman, Katharine Hepburn, in luring a dedicated scientist, Cary Grant, away from his work to join her in amorous frolic. This is hardly a goal that would be applauded by most leftists, who tend to disapprove of frivolous play. But the movie's tone says otherwise. In the first place, the Grant character is engaged to be married to a prim, sexless associate who is utterly devoid of humor. She regards their work as all-important, even to the exclusion of taking a honeymoon or eventually having children. She is the work ethic incarnate. Enter the Hepburn character, flighty, beautiful, and rich. Once she discovers that Grant is about to be married, she determines that only she must have him, and she contrives a series of ruses to lure him away from his fiancée. Hepburn's character is exciting and exasperating, but fun. Grant is forced to shed his stodgy demeanor merely to keep up with her desperate antics. She proves to be his salvation, and they are united at the film's conclusion. Clearly, they are made for each other. In short, the charm of Hawks' screwball comedy lies precisely in what critic Robin Wood described as the lure of irresponsibility. The middle-class work ethic is portrayed as joyless, as dry as the fossil bones that Grant and his fiancée have devoted their lives to. Is the film devoid of ideology? Certainly not. During the 1930s, there were many American movies that dealt with the style and glamour of the rich, who were often portrayed as eccentric and good-hearted. Hawks' film is very much in this tradition. The hardships of the Depression are not even alluded to in the movie, and the film settings, expensive nightclubs, swanky apartments, gracious country homes, are precisely what audiences of that era craved in order to forget about the Depression. But the movie is not overtly political. The emphasis is on the charisma of the leading players and the madcap adventures they pursue. The luxurious lifestyle of the heroine enhances her appeal, and the fact that she doesn't have a job, nor seem to want one, is simply not relevant. Bringing Up Baby is a comedy and a love story, not a social critique. The ideologies outlined in this chapter are conceptual models that can be helpful in understanding what a given movie seems to be saying, consciously or unconsciously, in terms of values. But they are merely formulas and cliches unless they seem relevant to our emotional experience of a movie. In analyzing a film's ideology, we need to determine its degree of explicitness. If the values are implicit, how do we differentiate the good guys from the bad? Do the stars embody ideological values, or were the actors cast precisely because they don't convey a ready-made set of moral assumptions? Are the cinematic techniques ideologically weighted? The mise-en-scene, the editing, costumes, decor, dialects? Is the protagonist a spokesperson for the filmmaker? How do you know? Is the protagonist primarily a leftist, centrist, or rightist? What cultural values are embodied in the film? What role, if any, does religion play? Are there any ethnic values present? What about sexual politics? How are women portrayed? Any gay characters? Does the movie adhere to the genre's usual conventions, or are they subverted? What is the film's tone? Does the tone reinforce or mock the values of the characters? Next chapter, Chapter 11 Critique. Thanks for watching. Presented by thebullyexposed.com.